Perfect. Thank you. So thanks for the opportunity to present to your investor community today, Ola. I'm Ellen Donnelly, the CEO of Abliva. Abliva is a biotech company located in Lund, Sweden, and we have an outpost here now in Boston, where I'm based right now. At Abliva, we're focused on the development of therapeutics for the treatment of a family of rare diseases called primary mitochondrial diseases. Because these diseases are pretty rare, most people haven't heard of them. So we're going to start a little bit and talk about the biology underpinning primary mitochondrial diseases. So as you know, our bodies are made up of many, many cells. We actually think it's about 37 trillion cells. There's a scientific group that actually did an analysis of how many cells there are in our human bodies, 37 trillion. And those come together to form tissues, organs, and finally systems. And in that cell system, there are about 200 different kinds of cells. You've heard of many of them, blood cells, muscle cells. We talk about these all the time, but we don't talk about their source of energy, and that's the mitochondria. So each of these cells, every cell, every one of those 37.2 trillion cells in your body is comprised of a lot of mitochondria. These mitochondria are fueling your cells and helping your cells do what they need to do on a daily basis. So we call the mitochondria the powerhouse of the cell. They are generating the chemical energy that your cells need to power that cell. Super important organelle that has been kind of, there just hasn't been much understanding of how to target them in drug development. And that's the reason you may not have heard of them. We all hear about neurons and nerves because of Alzheimer's disease and the importance of Alzheimer's disease to all of us. But mitochondria, because it's a rare disorder, it's a little bit more unknown. So every cell in your body has these mitochondria except your red blood cells. And the number of mitochondria in those cells depends on how much energy that cell needs. So a cell that needs a lot of energy, like your muscle cells, which are constantly working, may have more mitochondria. Your brain has a lot of mitochondria in your cells, liver. And then cells that don't need as much energy obviously would have fewer. These are also interesting because they have their own source of DNA. So as you all know, nuclear DNA is what we all have. But your mitochondria have their own DNA, and that's come from your mother, which is pretty interesting. The sperm DNA is actually, mitochondrial DNA is actually degraded. And so we end up with your mom's mitochondrial DNA. So you can imagine that this is a pretty important organism for our body. So our colleagues at Abliva have been studying mitochondrial dysfunction for over 20 years. And that's pretty unknown. This was kind of just an area of academic interest 20 years ago. Eskil Elmer, who you can see on the left, is a founder of Abliva. And he's our CSO right now, our Chief Scientific Officer. So Eskil is responsible for the preclinical development of our assets. And he has a lab at Lund University, which you can see here next to him, and a team of colleagues that do the preclinical experiments to better understand our mechanism of action and our ability to move that compound forward in development. Magnus Hansen has also been working with Eskil. They met at Lund University a long time ago and have been working on this ever since. And Magnus is responsible for our development organization. So Magnus is our Chief Medical Officer. He works with a team of colleagues at Medicon Village to ensure that we can put these compounds coming out of the labs into humans. Both of these guys are supported by a great number of colleagues and contractors that bring a host of drug development experience to the table. So really fortunate to have that team, most of them based in Medicon Village. So you may ask, what are these primary mitochondrial disorders? So let's talk a little bit about PMD. I think the best source of information is actually directly from the patients, because I can describe their disease to you for hours, and it won't be real until you hear it from a patient. So I would suggest that you go to our website, abliva.com, and you can see videos from two patients. We have Rebecca up here on the top left. You'll hear from her parents, and then we have Roger. They both suffer from primary mitochondrial diseases, and I think their videos will really make this disease real to you. We also have an exciting opportunity coming up because World Mitochondrial Disease Awareness Week is coming up, and we're going to do a set of vignettes and interviews during that. And you can meet Daniela, another patient with primary mitochondrial disease, during that week in September. So I would suggest that you all either check out the videos or come join us during the Mitochondrial Disease Awareness Week, because really the patients can tell you more about their disease than we can. It's rare. It affects about 1 in 5,000 individuals. It is debilitating and devastating to every one of them. The life expectancy can be quite short. A child could end up perishing within the first 5 years. Some patients live much longer. It depends on how many of those mitochondria and what mitochondria are impacted. They have no options. There are no approved therapies for these drugs. There is one approved therapy for a rare eye disease called the Debenone, but that's it. So unless you have this rare eye disease, you are told by your physician you have primary mitochondrial disease, and they provide you with supportive care as possible. As we've mentioned, the organs requiring the most energy are the most severely impacted: muscles, brain, liver. And so we'll go on and we'll talk more about that. So the Abliva portfolio is shown here. We have KL1333 as our lead asset. That asset is about ready to start a phase 2/3 registrational study. So what does that mean? This study was the one study that was necessary to go for approval of our drug. So if the KL1333 phase 2/3 study works, we're hoping to talk to the regulators about marketing authorization for that drug. That could be as soon as 2026. So we call this a late stage asset. We're one study away from the potential to submit this for marketing authorization. The second program, NV354, is also interesting. It is about ready to start clinical studies. So right now we're working to get that full package ready so that it can go into its first healthy volunteers. That would be a phase 1 study. The reason these molecules are interesting is they both target different types of PMD. KL1333 does not get into the brain. And so we're looking at that for adult patients with multisystemic disease. NV354 does get into the brain, so we can use that one for PMD diseases that actually have more of a cognitive impact. As I mentioned, we have a lab, we have some early ideas, and hope to, again, advance new programs into the portfolio as these other programs are developed. So I just want to talk about some things that are happening in the external environment that are really preparing us and kind of decreasing our risk to get these therapeutics out there. So I titled this "The Time Is Now," and it really is. We have a new increased understanding of the biology behind mitochondrial dysfunction. This is complicated. You might remember it from early biology. We have the Krebs cycle, TCA cycle, electron transport chain. I remember in biology, I was always counting the number of hydrogens that were moving all over the cell. We know much more about it than we did then, and that's going to help us develop drugs to target them. We have numerous regulatory tools. So as you know, the regulators have all had an interest in getting drugs developed for these orphan diseases. It costs a lot of money. They want to help us do it and get these drugs to these patients. And so that we have a number of tools available to us to use with the regulators. We also have started to see organization with the patient groups. And this is very, very important in a rare disease because, as you know, these patients are scattered. They often haven't met somebody with their same disorder, and they really need support. And so these patient groups have been very helpful in finding patients, educating patients, talking to patients about clinical studies, helping them understand what we're doing when we talk about developing a drug. And expert centers have also started to come up. So these centers kind of are the center of the PMD patient's treatment algorithm. So they may receive a patient from a physician and diagnose that PMD. They may be responsible for the management of that PMD patient. They also help us recruit patients into studies because these are large centers with lots of patients. And the best thing that they do is they have a database of all these patients. So these patients are finally able to find each other, interact with physicians, and participate in clinical studies. So all of this is kind of the confluence of all this has really come about in the last few years. And this really decreases our risk. It decreases our time to market, and it can decrease significantly our costs. And so that's why a company like Abliva, a small company based in Lund, Sweden, has the ability to not only progress programs into late stage development, but we can commercialize them too, because we know exactly the centers we need to go to, and we know where those patients are sitting. So an example of how this works, KL1333 has ODD designation. That's called Orphan Drug Designation. That will allow us to work with the FDA and the regulators in order to get this drug approved. We can have constant communication with them, ask them questions about our regulatory program. So that really decreases the regulatory risk. It also speeds up our development timeline because instead of having to have 2 phase 3 studies, in this case, we have 1 phase 2/3 study that we're hoping, if the data supports it, will be a registrational study. The other thing that we often hear about is the potential opportunity here. As you've heard, much more so with the Alzheimer's disease asset, the pricing is allowed to be much higher in a rare disease asset. And so here you can see a back of the envelope market assessment of the peak sales for KL1333, and you can see they hit $1 billion. This is a pretty conservative model. I've taken a conservative estimate as to the diagnosis rate, the treatment rate. I assumed we were second to market, and I assumed a pretty low price point for a premium therapeutic in rare diseases, and still we hit $1 billion. So there's really quite a bit of opportunity here in this space. So you might ask me, what's happening with this drug? So here you can see the plan. So we're about to start a study. We call it Falcon. We say the Falcon is about to fly. That'll start later this year. And then we'll run it to an interim analysis. This study is going to include 40 adult patients with systemic mitochondrial DNA mutations that have PMD. We're also requiring that they have fatigue and they have muscle myopathy because those are the 2 primary endpoints in this study. These 40 patients will run to an interim analysis, and at the interim analysis, we'll do futility and sample size adjustment, and then determine the final size of the study, which will be between 120 and 180 total patients. This is a long study. The patients will take our medicine twice a day for 12 months. Luckily, they don't have to come into the office or into the clinic very frequently. We've designed a study that is very patient-friendly, so most of the assessments can be done at home. That's really important for these patients. They often have a hard time walking. They have very little energy, and they may be kind of homebound. So we wanted to make sure they had the best opportunity to actually enter our study. And as I mentioned, we're looking at fatigue and muscle weakness as our primary endpoints. So you may ask, how likely is this to succeed? You've just told me about this clinical study. What are the chances? I don't know. But what we've tried to do is we've tried to de-risk the study as much as possible so that we do get a positive readout. So first, we developed a package of preclinical data. We did assays with KL1333 using cells from PMD patients, using animals, in order to test the effects of KL1333 in those models. And we found, in short, this is just an example, that we could improve mitochondrial function, improve muscle function, and impact the relevant biomarkers. At that same time, we were also looking at the safety profile because you want to make sure that this is going to be safe in healthy volunteers and patients. And we've confirmed that it is both in dosing healthy volunteers and patients. We've dosed over 110. And we've also done the chronic toxicology studies that are required to move this forward in development. So the profile looks great. So the next thing we did is we wanted to go and look at the efficacy of this drug in patients. And so we added a cohort to our phase 1 study. This is called a phase 1B cohort with PMD patients. This study was run in the UK at UCL and Newcastle, and it was run during COVID. So we're really thankful that these patients were willing to participate as well as the physicians. It was really a remarkable time to try to do clinical research. In this cohort, we had 6 patients treated with drug, and we had two patients treated with placebo. And I'm just looking because I'm missing a slide. And in that, we looked at 3 clinical endpoints. We looked at two fatigue endpoints. One was after 7 days. So the patient would be asked to look back 7 days and say, how often in the past 7 days have you done X, Y, or Z? And the other was the daily fatigue impact scale. And that asked the patients to look back over 24 hours. And we were really excited to see a difference in both the placebo and KL1333 arm in that study. We had a third endpoint we also looked at. So we had the 2 fatigue endpoints, and we had a muscle weakness endpoint. And this is called the 30-second sit to stand. And in that endpoint, the patient was asked to stand up and sit down as many times as they could within 30 seconds. And we did, again, see a difference in those two groups in that. So that was pretty exciting because we saw these differences and we think that they're clinically meaningful based on literature searches. So that means that the patient would likely feel a different from that data. But then we went one step further, and that's the slide you can see here. We showed that there's an exposure effect relationship. So we showed that when you get more drug in the blood, the patients do better. And so that helped us design the right dose for our upcoming study. One of the things we did coming out of that, since it was so effective in fatigue, we wanted to make sure that the fatigue questions we were asking the patients were actually relevant to their disease. Because these fatigue question banks are quite large and they have a lot of questions. And often in clinical studies, you'll say, okay, we'll just use that fatigue scale that already exists. But we wanted to make sure it was specific to PMD patients. And I'll give you an example of why. One of the questions in one of the databases is says, how often over the past 7 days have you had a problem doing strenuous exercise? These patients don't do exercise. They're lucky to make it to the grocery store and make it home without feeling completely exhausted. So it's questions like that that got eliminated. And in this process, we created a PMD-specific endpoint, the PROMIS Fatigue PMD short form, that was created by patients specific to their fatigue and will be used as a primary endpoint in our upcoming study. So this is the graphic of the study. As I mentioned, it's going to start later this year. We'll move to an interim, and then we hope to complete the study in about 3 years. What have we been doing recently? Well, we were happy to complete a major financing round in June. This financing was one of the top 10 that happened in Europe during the second quarter. We raised 200 million SEK, and we're quite pleased with that. We did it through a combination of a directed share issue, which brought in new life science and institutional investors into the company. And we also added a rights issue, which allowed the current shareholders to participate, which was super important for us. That 200 million will take us a long way. It gives us a 2-year runway. It takes our lead program to this major inflection point at the interim analysis, and it will progress that second program as well. Really excited to get that done and appreciate everybody's support of that raise. So after that, we launched a major effort, getting the story out there, getting visibility increased. You can read our reports on our website. You can see many of the articles. We do fireside chats with shareholders whenever I come to town. So really a good opportunity to learn more about Abliva on our website. We also have spent a lot of time talking to the patients and the physicians. So we were recently at the big annual meeting in the US where Magnus presented the study to the patients and physicians that were attending. And then Eleanor did a fantastic job at BioBlast in Austria, where she not only presented some basic science, but also we published a review of the space at that meeting. And then as you can see on the right, we're going to a host of other meetings in global locations, trying to get our story out and just talking to more patients and physicians. As I mentioned, we are in growth phase. Really excited to have that raise behind us and really ready to move forward aggressively. Our hope is to, by 2027, we have a drug on the market and others in the clinic. So as I mentioned, we are on the track to become a global leader in mitochondrial medicine. We have an experienced team with over 20 years of experience in mitochondrial research and drug development. We have that major focus in Lund, Sweden, but we've opened the office in Boston and continue to grow that. We have full R&D capabilities, and we have the ability to commercialize an asset. We have a portfolio of programs. And as you probably know, we're publicly traded on NASDAQ. And we now have a financial runway that's pretty significant. So thrilled to be here today. Happy to answer any questions on that.
Thank you very much. I have a few questions about this interim analysis. What is the purpose of that and what information do you expect to get from these first 40 patients?
Yep, great question. So as you imagine, in rare diseases, these patients are hard to find, and we want to make sure that we give them drugs that are efficacious to their disease. So it helps, and it helps both of us. So the 40 patients will be enrolled to the interim analysis, and then we'll have a chance to pause and look at the data in a blinded fashion. But the first thing that you do in an interim analysis is futility. So if the drug isn't working, the study stops. You save other patients from wasting their time in the study. I think that that's super important, especially in a rare disease. Every study should have that futility. We'll also do a sample size readjustment. So that blinded committee will look at the data and say, okay, what are the chances that the study will be successful with this many patients or that many patients? And they'll give us guidance as to the final size of the study. Again, another very important step, because we don't want to recruit too many patients. We obviously want to get this drug to market, but we also want to make sure that there's a signal that we can detect. So if you enroll too few patients, you might just miss that effect that was there if you'd enrolled more. So that's the nice thing about the interim. It really gives us a great ability in a blinded fashion to kind of make sure that what we're doing is right.
Yeah. What does the competitive landscape look like in mitochondrial diseases?
That's a great question as well. So we're all kind of at the same point. There aren't many of us, and we're all in kind of a similar size. There are a few US competitors as well. Reneo has a PPAR delta modulator that's at a similar stage. Astellas acquired a small company called Mitobridge, and they have a PPAR delta at a similar stage. Nobody else has our mechanism. We're a first-in-class mechanism, and we're all in this phase 2-3 space. So those are kind of our competitors in the systemic area. Then there's another group of companies that are all looking at cognitive impacts of the disease, and they're a little bit earlier in development. So it's a small group. I'd say there are 6-7 players, and rare disease. This is a rare disease, so big pharma has obvious interest in it, but none of them are really in this space yet.
Yeah, there aren't many American biotech CEOs running Swedish companies. Please tell us why you are decided to join Abliva and how you work across these two countries.
Yeah, that's usually the first question I get. And then the second question is, and do you speak Swedish? And no, it's awful. So thank you all for putting up with my English today. So we relocated to Sweden in 2016. My husband took a job in a major pharma company in oncology. And so we decided it was the time to do something different. And at that time, I left my job. I had been at Pfizer for 10 years, left my job and jumped out and just decided to do something different. And I took a job as a CEO of another rare disease company. We were focused on sickle cell disease, and just love that. I love working with the patients. I think it's a really important thing to do. And so worked with them for a few years, moved to London, and then got called back to Abliva. So super excited to be working with this team.
Good. 2021, the company had higher costs than previous years. Why?
2021 was our start to this clinical study. We started working with the CRO and getting things up to speed so that once we raised the financing, we could kick it off. And so those costs are seen in the 2021 numbers. It's a nice way to do things, actually, because as you all know, clinical studies are quite expensive. And so what we did, instead of taking the whole hit now, we basically broke that up into study startup agreements so we could do a little bit as we went along. And so that's where you see that cost in 2021. Our size has remained the same. We do not put a lot of money into organizational issues. We try to keep slim and nimble and do everything through consultants.
Yeah, and then a question from the listeners. Is the plan to find treatment for other mitochondrial diseases? Are there other diseases that could be interesting for you?
Absolutely. Good question. Yes, there is a lot of expansion opportunity here. KL1333 already is a fairly big market. As I showed you, it could be $1 billion, if not 2 or 3, depending on your assumptions. NV354, the second program, has a smaller population, but we think that drug is working on an important complex that also is dysfunctional in other mitochondrial diseases. So we can expand within PMD. Then we can expand outside of PMD into other rare disorders. Friedreich's ataxia may be one. There are many. Or you could actually go outside of the rare diseases as well and go to more common areas. Our focus is a rare disease focus, so I don't think you'll see us doing that, but there is expansion opportunity with both assets.
Okay, and then the final question. Our investors today invest in a broad range of companies across many industries. With so many options available, why should our investors be interested in Abliva?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the thing about Abliva is we're differentiated from many of the other companies across the biotech spectrum. with that late stage asset. We could have this market, this drug on the market by 2026 if everything goes well. If it doesn't, 2027. And that's a quick time. And you could see a very significant return on your investment. If you look at our share price right now, I think you'll understand that it's quite low. I think that we're kind of flying under the radar still, significantly undervalued compared to the other companies. So I think, if you're an investor that likes to come along with the ride, I think we're very communicative. We love to bring in new shareholders. And I think this could be a really interesting opportunity for a pretty significant ROI if it works.
Okay, thank you very much, Ellen, and thank you for joining us this day. Thanks.
Thank you, Ola, and thanks for everyone for putting up with my English. I appreciate it. Have a good day.
Thanks.
Bye.
Same to you. Bye.